I want to welcome my dear friend and mentor, the Reverend Willis Foster, rector of St. Stephen's, Petersburg, an historic African American parish founded in 1867. Willis, it's so good to have you here. Willis was incredibly helpful as a co-facilitator working with some of the parishes when I was serving for the diocese. And he is not only an Episcopal priest, he has served on the board of the Union of Black Episcopalians. He is on the diocesan committee called Repairers of the Breach, which addresses racism and racial reconciliation. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Yeah. And he is also a retired lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps. I have the highest regard for Willis, who is a dear friend, and I thank you for being on today. And I guess you know, as Friday is Juneteenth, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that and your own experience of that, and why it's important to you.
Before I get into that, I have to say that I had an internal smile when you call me a mentor, because when I speak about you to other people, I tell them that you are my mentor. In fact, you are one of the reasons that I am a priest today. So without you, I would not be here. So I just want to say thank you.
Well, thank you, Willis. As any good friendship, we learn from each other, but I'll never forget those rides up 460.
Oh yeah.
We had great conversation.
Oh yeah. Well, you know, the thing about Juneteenth, I did not know about Juneteenth until 1972. In 1971, late 1971, I was stationed at Fort Walters, Texas, and that's in a little town called Mineral Wells, Texas. Fort Walters no longer exists, but it was in Mineral Wells, Texas, that I experienced my first Juneteenth celebration. And it was a great celebration, and in fact, we would celebrate it each year I was there, sometimes in Fort Worth, Texas, other times in Mineral Wells. But the important thing, I think, about my experience with Juneteenth was the fact that I did not experience it until 1971.
How old were you then?
Let's see, I was born in 1948. So that was somewhere around 22, 23, something like that. I can't do the math in my head, but I was in my early 20s. And so I never heard about Juneteenth. Yeah. I was never taught about Juneteenth in the history books. In fact, the only thing I heard about the emancipation was when it was published, you know, and people would have watch services in the expectation of Lincoln signing the document. And so when I heard about Juneteenth in my 20s, one, I was amazed that it took so long to get there, but that it was a celebration in that state. All the Black folk would get together and celebrate that time. But I guess the thing that strikes me is that, one, I didn't know about it. I wasn't taught about it. And that history was kept from me. Mm-hmm. Not only was it kept from me, but it was kept from the people around me, and it was kept from the greater population. You know, Juneteenth is a critical piece in our history as a nation. the Emancipation Proclamation is a critical piece of the history of our nation. And it is one piece of the freedom that we as Americans experience. Now, I'll probably say something that is controversial right now. We hear people talking about Black Lives Matter. And in my thought about how this nation has operated in the past and operates right now is, if you're not white, you're Black.
Yes.
Think about that.
Yes.
So, you know, people will say brown lives matter, yellow lives matter, red lives matter, or whatever of those things. But if you're not white, and specifically white Anglo-Saxon Protestant,
True.
you don't matter. And on top of that, your history doesn't matter. And so the things we struggle with in terms of our history, we talk about Black history, we talk about indigenous peoples' history, we talk about the history of Asians in America, we talk about the history of the Irish in America and the Italians in America, but we really don't talk about or celebrate American history. And so our history in America won't matter, doesn't matter, until we celebrate the history of all peoples that have contributed to this beautiful patchwork quilt that is America. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense, and I'm right with you. And, you know, I mean, until recently, we celebrated in this state Lee Jackson Day. I'm incredulous.
I first came to Virginia in 1985. And then I came back to Virginia in 1995, and it was Lee Jackson King Day.
Yes.
And that was abhorrent to me. Just to hear those three together it just made my skin crawl, and I cringed.
I can imagine. You know, I was thinking it would be like the Germans celebrating Hitler, Goebbels, and Elie Wiesel Day.
Well, you know, Suffolk was a place where they had prisoners of war in Suffolk.
I know.
And they had more freedoms than the Black folk that were born and raised in Suffolk. But the thing that I found incredulous was Lee and Jackson fought for my ancestors' subjugation.
Yes.
Fought for their denial of full personhood. And we matched them up with a person that fought for the rights of not only Black Americans, but poor Americans.
Yes.
And so the thing that is so incredulous to me is, how can we and how do we honor people that were treasonous, that fought against all that we stand for as a nation? And so Juneteenth for me is an affirmation of who we are as Black folk, and potentially who we are as Americans. You know, we are guaranteed, even though the Constitution wasn't specifically written that way, all of us are guaranteed certain freedoms and justice. You know, In the
Yes.
beginning, it was about those land owners, those white men that owned land. They were the ones. But we've interpreted that Constitution, those Bill of Rights, to include all of us who have breath in us.
Yes.
You know, and so I can't help but think about, you know, this is the priest part coming out, right?
Go for it.
I can't help but think about that thing out of Isaiah. You know, God has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to the oppressed, to the imprisoned. You know, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Emancipation Proclamation was good news to the poor and the oppressed. Good news to all of America. I sat on the lap of my great-grandmother, Mary Lucretia. She was born a slave in Mississippi. Her husband was lynched in Mississippi. My grandfather was an Episcopal priest in Mississippi. Anyway, I have lived a long life and a good life, but it's not a life that has been free.
Yes.
I tell people, black people weren't freed in this United States until the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, until those acts were passed. And even then, we're not free. So I don't know if that was helpful or not, but
that was very helpful. Let me ask you this question. What, as you're watching what has emerged over the last few weeks, what is your reaction and hope?
Well, there is hope that more people will not only listen, but act.
Mm-hmm.
There is hope for the future. I was reading the Virginia Pilot Sunday morning, and there was a picture of a young man, 17 years old with a bullhorn, and he was talking to the protesters and guiding the protesters in how to march peacefully. In the New York Times, I was reading that Sunday morning, there was a picture of an 18-year-old young lady, black young lady, standing at a podium, speaking to the crowd and getting them to put them together to march peacefully. And it gave me hope for the young people. You know, some older folk like myself will say, you know, I worry about the nation today because the young folk are all right.
They are all right.
The young folk are in the driver's seat, and they're driving us in a great direction. So my hope is in the young folk that are picking up the torch and going forward with it. My hope is that people will not only hear what's really being said, but to act on what's being said. We talked about the other day about a book called 1919, which is a book of poetry that looks at the report of the riots that happened in 1919, the Red Summer in Chicago. And the results of that report that was done in 1922, it was written by 6 white men and 6 black men that were well respected in the community. the results of that report were the same results that came out of the report on the riots in Harlem in the 1940s. It was the same results that came out of the Canon report about the riots in the 1960s. All these reports chronicle the same issues, the same problems, the same injustices that happen not only with Black folk, but with poor folk.
Yes.
And so it's not for lack of knowledge, it's not for lack of information that these problems continue. It's due to the lack of courage, the lack of wanting to do, willing to do the hard work of speaking honestly to each other and doing the hard work that it takes for all of us to be treated justly,
Yes.
for all of us to be given good education, for all of us to be able to live in decent housing, for all of us to be able to make a living wage.
Yes.
You know, those things were noted in 1919. Better housing,
Yes.
better education, a living wage, clean living conditions. Those same things come out in each report.
Yes. Yes. It's time, I think, for those of us who were born into white privilege to be quiet and listen and learn and know that we all have a stake together in justice, equal protection under the law, but also for all of us, to quote the Declaration of Independence, to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we can't pursue happiness if we are afraid and if we don't have what we need in life. I think about, I'll let the preacher in me say, shalom. Shalom is, you know, it's about us all having those things that make life worth living, and that's a compassion, but it's got to start with truth telling and understanding. I mean, does that make sense to you?
Oh yeah, and part of that truth telling though is in that being quiet is self-reflection.
Yes.
Because all of us have internalized racist ideas.
Yes.
I am racist in my thought process, not only about white people, but about Black people and about myself. I have internalized I'm losing words right now. I've internalized the dialogue that movies, TV shows, the media has said about me.
Yes.
About being a Black man, being a Black person. I've internalized those limitations, and I have to work beyond that internalization, those racist ideas I have about myself, along with those racist ideas I have about you.
Yes.
So I have to have I have to reflect.
Yes.
Just like I would ask you to reflect on those ideas, those racist ideas that say that you are better than I am, or you are whatever your notion is of yourself.
Yeah, and I think for those of us who are white, there are assumptions. There are assumptions that are never checked out. The questions that are never asked, and that's why you were kind enough to read a letter that I wrote to the parish after the death of George Floyd, because I got blinders, and I want those blinders to be called and noted so I can reflect on those.
I had a friend of mine write a Facebook post, and I thought it was very telling. And he said when he was getting ready to graduate from college, he was nervous about getting a job. Well, he was wondering about, will I get hired? And if I do get hired, will I be successful? Will I do what needs to be done and all of that? And he was expressing his thoughts to his father. And his father said to him, you know, you're a good student, you work hard, you have a good work ethic, but most important is you are a white man. And he said he was comforted when his father told him that. He was a white man, which meant everything's going to be okay, because this is who you are. Not only what you are able to do, what you've been taught to do, but more importantly, you are a white man. And he says he's thought about that here lately, and he's starting to realize what his dad was saying and what that meant in his life. I'm not saying anything was wrong with what his dad was saying. That's where his dad was at that point in time. But we have to think about, what does it mean? What does that mean at this time and at this place? Where does that put me in this time and this place? Again, as a black man, are my thoughts as valid as yours? Are my thoughts as important as yours? Is my life as important as yours? If the answer is yes, they are, then why do you allow this nation's policies to affect me in the way that they are affecting me? That makes sense?
Yes, it makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense. Well, listen, my brother, I have I don't want to keep you forever, and I have to go, but I want to say this. I deeply appreciate your time today. My hope is that Juneteenth becomes one of many opportunities for all of us, whatever our background, to talk about our history and about our, to answer that question that we are all, I mean, we're all beloved and pleasing children of God. We have, you know, you and I, our faith is we are all, in the eyes of God, God's children. And it is a tragic history of the United States. And it's time for us to be honest about it and walk together.
Yeah, let us act on that belief.
Yes.
And as an aside, so come the next Juneteenth, I got my dad's grill.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be smoking some brisket and a couple of butts. So you and Kathy are invited to the house.
We accept. And I hope this will be one of many conversations that you and I can have. Before you go, as I said, one of the great joys was driving up to Petersburg with you and out to the western part of the diocese, and all the things you taught me and shared with me. I was listening. And please give my love to anyone at St. Stephen's who was around then who might remember me. Tell them how much I loved, what a high point it was to go to St. Stephen's. And please send my love.
I will, and thank you so much. Oh, you can't go to that Dairy Freeze place anymore. It's now Big Daddy's Barbecue.
Oh, well, that's all right. Thank you so much. God bless.
Thank you, and bless you too, Win. Bless you.
Love you, brother.
Love you too.